Good afternoon, and welcome to the NTSB Roundtable, a safe system approach to traffic safety. I am Tom Chapman, and I am honored to serve as the 46th member of the National Transportation Safety Board. I will be the moderator for today's event. Our roundtable will last for 2 hours and will be recorded. Later this week, the recording of the roundtable will be available on the NTSB event page and the NTSB YouTube channel. Quite intentionally, we timed this event to coincide with the United Nations Global Road Safety Week. In recent years, we have seen a troubling upward trend in traffic deaths, especially among vulnerable road users, pedestrians, bicyclists, and motorcyclists. Many of us believe that reversing this trend requires a shift from a traditional driver-centric approach to an integrated, shared responsibility, safe system approach. Today's roundtable will serve as an NTSB Most Wanted List kickoff event on this topic. We will provide an overview of the tenets and elements of the safe system approach, and we'll present some national, state, and local perspectives with respect to the implementation. Before we proceed to our panel discussions, I'm pleased to share a special message from Deputy Secretary of Transportation, Polly Trottenberg. Deputy Secretary Trottenberg has an extensive career in public service at all levels of government. As most of you probably know, Polly served as New York City's Transportation Commissioner from 2014 to 2020. During that time, she helped implement New York City's landmark Vision Zero program. She has both an interest in and extensive experience with the issues we'll discuss today. So let's begin with this message from Deputy Secretary Trottenberg.
Thank you, Tom, for that generous introduction and for your many years of leadership in transportation. Your focus at NTSB on key safety issues, particularly impaired driving, is a model to all of us who work on transportation safety. I also want to thank my friend, Dr. Mats Åkerberg for being here today. His pioneering work on Vision Zero and Sweden's example as a leader in roadway safety have been such an inspiration to safety practitioners worldwide, myself included. I got to know Dr. Berlin early in my tenure as Commissioner of New York City DOT and spent some time with him in Sweden and in New York. He's always been so generous in sharing Sweden's experiences in roadway safety, and I've learned so much from him. I'm so glad he's here today to share his insights. Sadly, the United States has a long way to go in making our roads less deadly. You all know the numbers. Over 35,000 Americans die in traffic crashes each year. Hundreds of thousands of Americans are seriously injured. Our roadway fatality rate is dramatically higher than that of our European counterparts. And these aren't just statistics. They're our family, our friends, our colleagues, neighbors, and fellow Americans. A single preventable roadway death is one too many. That, of course, is the premise behind Vision Zero. To make Vision Zero a reality, we need a holistic, safe systems approach, and we need to make the necessary investments to get us there. At the national level, the experts at USDOT have done a lot of incredible safety work, but we need to do more still. Secretary Buttigieg has spoken often about making a generational investment in transportation infrastructure through President Biden's American Jobs Plan. The plan would make dramatic investments in repairing and redesigning roadways to make them safer for all users. The plan includes $20 billion for roadway safety, including a Safe Streets for All program that will support state and local Vision Zero plans. The plan would also dramatically increase funding for public transportation, passenger rail, and the deployment of electric vehicles. And because for the Biden-Harris administration, safety, equity, and resilience go hand in hand, 40% of the investments in clean infrastructure would go to underserved communities. If we want to meet the administration's racial equity goals, then we need to protect the pedestrians and cyclists of color who disproportionately die in crashes. And if we want to meet our climate goals, we need to make sure that people who switch from driving to walking or biking can get around safely. With the team we've built at USDOT, as well as the deep bench of agency expertise, we're hard at work on building safer roads, ensuring safer vehicles, and tackling unsafe driving behaviors. That work is being done in partnership with transportation leaders around the country and globally, elected officials, top safety experts in the advocacy community, academia, and industry, you here at the NTSB, and of course, local communities and stakeholders. In the next couple of hours, you'll hear from some incredible experts, including my colleague Robin Hutcheson, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Safety Policy and former head of the Minneapolis and Salt Lake City DOTs. At the U.S. Department of Transportation, our primary mission has always been safety, and we look forward to working with all of you to save lives on our roadways. Thank you, and I know we're going to have a terrific conference today.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary, for your remarks and your interest in the subject of today's roundtable event. This afternoon, we are fortunate to have with us an outstanding panel of experts in the field. Let me introduce you to Dr. Mats-Åke Bellin. Dr. Bellin is Director of Vision Zero Academy at the Swedish Transport Administration with over 30 years of experience working on overall safety policies. Dr. Bellin is also the Swedish delegate to the United Nations Road Safety Collaboration. Dr. Bellin will take us back to the 1990s and to Sweden to tell us a little bit about the history, the background, and the principles of the safe system approach. Welcome, Dr. Bellin. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Tom, for that kind intervention. It's great to be here and get this opportunity to share some of my experience with working with Vision Zero for a very long time. Let me first start a little bit with a background, why we started to think about Vision Zero in Sweden. And on this slide, you will see the number of fatalities per 100,000 inhabitants, the blue line, and the red line is the traffic growth. And after the World War II, when our society started to motorize, and that was very good for our society, I would say. But the problem was that the number of fatalities and serious injuries increased very dramatically. But in the end of the 60s, the Swedish government decided to set up a special traffic safety agency, and we were very, very influenced by US in that time. So we set up that government body. And since then, we start to work systematically with road safety. And as you can see on this slide, the number was dramatically decreased during the 70s. But then in the 80s, the number of fatalities start to increase again, and the government and the politicians and the citizens, they become more and more worried, and it was a sense of that we might lose the control now. More traffic, more fatalities, and more serious injuries. So they decided to take some steps. One of the steps was to change the institutional arrangement when it comes to road safety. So they closed down this traffic safety agency and they merged that agency together with the Swedish Road Administration. But then you can see that in the beginning of 90s, the number of fatalities dropped very dramatically. And I wish I could say that that was due to a fantastic road safety work that was carrying out, but that was not the case. The reason why we had that drop in the early 90s was due to a very severe economic recession in our society. And we know that economic recessions, at least in the short run, is something good from the safety point of view. So the experts in that time, me included actually, because I started already in 1990, was then start to discuss what are we doing next? When the wheels start to roll again in our society and we will, the economic start to grow again, we were in a big problem because the strategies that we have implemented during the 70s was not enough. We have to come up with something new. And that is what I would call the Vision Zero. And in 1997, and actually next year, Sweden will celebrate the 25th anniversary with Vision Zero. The Swedish Parliament adopted Vision Zero. And of course, this is a kind of ethical imperative, and it's emphasized that we can't accept that people get killed or serious injury when they drive, when they go in the traffic from A to B. We have to, we can't accept that. So that was a very bold decision in that time. But for us who work with safety, it's something more than that. It's a new strategy, a new way to think about road safety. And one way for me to explain this difference between Vision Zero and how we more traditionally work with safety is to compare these strategies. And let me start with the traditional approach. In a traditional approach, the problem that you try to solve is the problem with accident, or that, as you prefer in the US to say, crashes. And we know from in-depth studies that 90% of all crashes is due to human factors, human errors. And that is a kind of mantra, you know, it's been there since the introduction of the car in our society. So the focus has been very much on us as individual road users. So we have put the ultimately responsibility for safety is on us as individual road users. So if something goes wrong out there, you can always find an individual to blame from a legal point of view. And therefore, our strategy has been very much to try to creating a perfect human being who always doing the right thing through regulation, through enforcement, through education and information. So that has been our basic toolbox, our basic strategy to create safety. And also this traditional approach has very much been based on the idea that people don't want safety. So we have to come a little bit from the above and force people to behave in a safe way. And we don't think really that we can solve this problem. So we have been quite happy if we can step by step reduce the risk. And although we are not so explicit about it, we think that it's a kind of price that we have to pay for our mobility. So there is a kind of sense that we have an optimum number of fatalities and serious injuries in the road traffic. And Vision Zero as a policy challenged all these aspects now. First of all, the problem that we try to solve in Vision Zero is not the problem with the crashes per se. The problem that we try to solve is the problem that people get killed and seriously injured. And the reason why people get killed or seriously injured, according to a Vision Zero policy, is because people are people. We have young people, we have old people, we have all kinds of people using our road transport system. And instead of hoping that we can creating a perfect human being, we have to accept that people will make mistakes. And people are fragile. We have a certain tolerance against kinetic energy. So Vision Zero is very much about controlling for harmful energy, I would say. And I used to take one example just to show the difference between this more traditional approach and Vision Zero. If you have a typical 4-lane intersection and you have crashes in that intersection, the traditional approach to solve that problem is to put up a traffic light. The traffic light will definitely reduce the number of crashes in that intersection, but those who will happen will be very severe, because the typical scenario is that someone by mistake go against this red light, and due to the high speed and the high kinetic energy, the outcome will be very severe. But if you make a roundabout, the number of crashes might increase a little bit because it becomes a little bit more difficult to drive in a roundabout. But those who will happen will be less severe. And a matter of fact, a traffic light or a roundabout might actually be the difference between life and death. So therefore, in a Vision Zero policy, the ultimate responsibility for safety is put on us as system designers. And of course, the road users still have a responsibility, but when something goes wrong, it goes back to the system designers. Let me take another example, drink and driving. Sweden have a very long tradition of working with that. Already in 1940, we decided to set a special threshold for how much alcohol you are allowed to have in your blood when you're driving car. It was actually a Swedish doctor who came up with a method how to measure the alcohol concentration in the blood. And in that time, we put that in 0.8. And then we have changed it from 0.8 to 0.5, and now it's 0.2. And we have massive information, education program, and so on. And we also allowed police to make random breath controls. And all this package of interventions has been very successful, because if you make random controls in the traffic in Sweden, you will find that 99.8% of the traffic is sober. That is fantastic. But when we make in-depth studies of fatal crashes, we find that 25% of all fatal crashes is still alcohol related. So we don't have a social norm problem, but we have still a safety problem. Therefore, in a Vision Zero framework, probably one of the most effective countermeasure that we have for alcohol-related crashes today is a middle barrier. Because the middle barrier don't care if you are influenced by alcohol, drugs, or fatigue or distracted. It will only prevent you for killing yourself or someone else. And of course, we can't put up middle barriers everywhere. Therefore, in a Vision Zero framework, we try to push more for technology, different devices in the cars that will prevent us from drink and driving, such as alcohol lock and so on. So that is an example of how we have the same kind of behavior problem, but we change the way that we try to solve this problem. And Vision Zero is also based on the idea that people want safety. When we start a dialogue with citizens, with people about safety, we see that there is a huge amount of safety. Everyone want zero fatalities and serious injuries in your family, for yourself, and so on. So there is a huge demand for safety. And parents, for example, when they will allow their kids to go to and from school, there is no question. There is a huge demand for safety. And we as system designer, we have to deliver a safe system for them now. And of course, in the long run, we would like to eliminate fatalities and serious injuries, which most people think about as this Vision Zero. Let me take a few examples now on interventions that have been developed due to this Vision Zero. We started in an urban area, so you will see in our cities now lots of speed bump, lots of special speed limits, special separation of unprotected from protected road user, lots of traffic calming, roundabouts. In the rural area, you will see lots of this middle barrier program, which we call 2+1 roads. We used to have 0 kilometers of this road. Now we have more than 3,000 kilometers with these 2+1 roads, and they work fantastic. And we also have one of the largest safety camera program in the world per population. We also emphasize a lot when it comes to vehicle technology, intelligence, speed adaptation, alcohol lock, as I mentioned before, and so on. So this very important to use that, to take advantage of this technology, not only for protected road use in the cars, but also for unprotected road users. And in the middle of everything, you have to look into your speed limits, and you need to set your speed according to your safety standard of your roads and your car. So the way that we're setting the speed limits today is quite different from what we used to do. And of course, I can talk about lots of these interventions and some of the example here, but it's important to to see that when we started this journey in late 60s, we used to have 7 fatalities per 100,000 inhabitants, and Sweden had already in that time one of the safest transport system in the world. But now we are about 2 fatalities per 100,000 inhabitants. But that shows also that a country like Sweden, which was top performance when it comes to safety, could even do it better, you know. So it's a very promising message to everyone that you can always improve your safety. And of course, to create this now, you need a process that requires a multi-sectorial efforts among multi-goal organizations. But to make this happen, it's hard work, I would say. It will not happen by itself. That's my experience. You will need some lead agency, a facilitator, because things will not happen by itself. I would say that you also need a culture shift, especially I would say among the system designers, we as professionals, because we need to increase our responsibilization in order to deliver safety to consumers and citizens. And to make this happen, we have to expand our toolbox beyond regulation and bureaucracy in order to influence these system designers, like benchmarking program and so on, and management by objective. There are lots of different toolbox, but things will not happen by itself. So I will stop there and thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bellin. That's an excellent foundation for our discussion today. I want to invite you to stay with us now for the next panel. And I want to invite Jane Terry, Rachel Carpenter, Robin Hutcheson, and Betty Smoot-Madison to join Dr. Bellin to discuss the development and implementation of the safe system approach in the United States. While they're taking the steps necessary to check in, I will offer a brief introduction for each of our panelists. And I also want to thank those organizations and individuals who submitted questions today to help us plan for our panels. Robin Hutcheson is the U.S. Department of Transportation Deputy Assistant Secretary for Safety Policy. She has decades of leadership experience at the Salt Lake City and Minneapolis Departments of Transportation, and most recently, she served as the president of the National Association of City Transportation Officials. Jane Terry is a policy and legislative leader with the National Safety Council. She has nearly 20 years of experience working with local, state, and federal government officials in transportation and other issues. Prior to joining the National Safety Council, Ms. Terry served as the Director of Government Affairs here at the National Transportation Safety Board. Rachel Carpenter was appointed the California Department of Transportation's first ever Chief Safety Officer. Ms. Carpenter is an expert on safety practices and policies, and she serves as a member of the Transportation Research Board Committee on Bicycle Transportation. Betty Smoot-Madison is the Mobility Planning Director of the Atlanta Department of Transportation. Before joining Atlanta DOT, she worked for the Baltimore City Department of Transportation, where she initiated and led the city's first roadway safety program toward Zero Baltimore. Welcome to all of you. We have some good questions for you. I'm going to start with one for Dr. Bellin. Dr. Bellin, are you seeing the safe system approach applied in countries that are significantly different culturally from Europe? And how applicable is the safe system approach in our culturally diverse cities in the United States?
Okay, yeah, so from my perspective, it started in Sweden, and then this vision series diffused to the other Scandinavian countries. Then we saw that it was picked up by Australia. They changed the name from Vision Zero to Safe System. And then we have seen how this spreading to cities like New York, which Paul Trottenberg mentioned in her presentation. But now we also see that this ideas start to spreading to middle income countries at least. We have some example in Bogota, Mexico City, and the latest example on a city which talking about Vision Zero now is Moscow in Russia. And of course, there are similarities and differences now as every time an idea start to diffuse, you have to adjust to your context and so on. But I think that Vision Zero, there are lots of things in Vision Zero which is very universal. And one of these are this idea of controlling for harmful energy and the human tolerance against kinetic energy. It doesn't matter where you are, if you are in US, in Sweden, or Africa, or India, it's the same kind of human tolerance. So from that point of view, it's very universal, I would say. Another thing is, because as I mentioned in my presentation, Vision Zero is very much about creating a system, a technology that support people to survive. And our traditional approach has been very much an idea of creating this perfect human being. And it seems to be almost a mission impossible, I would say. It's very difficult for different reasons in different countries to creating this perfect human being. And if we take US as an example, which really, as an outsider, I can see into your country and I see that you really value personal freedom, for example. Why not integrate safety then into how you design your system? Because then you don't need to have a discussion about value freedom, because a traffic calming is a traffic calming, either you like it or not, you know. So it's really nudge people to do this sort of thing voluntary or automatically, I would say. So therefore, I think that there are things in Vision Zero which is very universal, I would say.
Next, a question for Jane Terry. Jane, can you tell us a little about the history of the Road to Zero Coalition and the 3 interrelated approaches identified by the coalition to achieve the vision of zero roadway deaths by 2050?
Yeah, thank you, Member Chapman, for that question. And thank you for inviting me and the National Safety Council here today. So the conversation around the Road to Zero Coalition really began at a time when it felt like we had plateaued on the roadway fatalities in this country. So National Safety Council with some of the DOT agencies, NHTSA, Federal Highway Administration, and Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration started talking about how we could do more and really focus on a goal of zero fatalities. So we got together a diverse group of stakeholders to serve as a steering group for this coalition. And then in the fall of 2016, held our first meeting. We had about 200 people there from a range of different types of organizations, including government, industry, academia, and others. And it was very exciting to have so many people come out to show their support for a goal of zero fatalities in this country. Of course, along the way, we also have been joined by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention as well, committed to this goal. And so from the start, the Road to Zero Coalition has really been about how do we work together and lean on each other's strengths and be able to learn from successes and failures to be able to do things differently going forward. And it started also with a strong foundation from groups like Towards Zero Deaths and the Vision Zero Network. And from that work, we were able to produce in 2018 a report outlining how do we reach this audacious goal of zero fatalities. And there are 3 main pillars. It's double down on what works, advance technology, and then prioritize safety through implementing a safe system approach and improving safety culture. Of course, we're still working on all of these today, but I think some quick examples of these items can include the countermeasures that work documents that Federal Highway Administration and NHTSA produce to help communities with proven effective countermeasures to implement. From a technology perspective, some of the vehicle technology, such as automatic emergency braking, lane departure warning, these systems can help prevent or mitigate crashes. And then thinking about vehicle to everything, or V2X connected car technology that really provides that safety redundancy we haven't necessarily had. And then of course, as NTSB knows, that last one is going to be the hardest one, and that's changing the safety culture and really shifting the attitudes and priorities of people who are using that system. And it is helpful to think of this, I think, through the lens of a safe system and these 5 elements of a safe system, which are safe roads, safe road users, safe speeds, safe vehicles, and effective post-crash care when you're thinking about these.
Thank you, Jane. And for all of our panelists, if you have something you'd like to add, or if you want to chime in, feel free to do so. You can use the raise your hand function if you'd like, or just speak up. That'll be fine. We certainly don't want to discourage any discussion. Robin, Assistant Secretary Hutcheson, thank you for joining us today on behalf of DOT. Can you tell us, please, based on your experience leading the Salt Lake City and Minneapolis Departments of Transportation, and also the National Association of City Transportation Officials, what are the main challenges and opportunities that city transportation officials face in implementing the safe system approach?
Thank you so much, Member Chapman, for the, I'll call you Tom Chapman. You asked us to please be familiar with you, but I can't help but call you Member Chapman and just recognize all the great work that you've done. And thank you so much for having me here today. I come from local government into the federal role with perhaps some unique perspectives. One, in that I don't think it's common to have someone who's come up as a practitioner in really in roadway safety and in local transportation come into this very broad policy role in safety. And 2, my actual title is Deputy Assistant Secretary for Safety Policy at the U.S. Department of Transportation, which has not existed before. So it is a focus, I think, that it's that focus that I've had at the local level that I'm doing my best on this very steep learning curve, I will admit, bringing it to a national level. Salt Lake City and Minneapolis were very different experiences, but also very similar experiences, in that one of the main challenges at that level is some resistance to change. And in fact, a great acceptance of the goals on the whole together, but resistance when you go to change the actual roadway in front of somebody's house. And that is something that I know, I'm talking to Betty right now. I know that you guys have experienced that in Atlanta. I'm sure that you experienced it in Baltimore, but overcoming the challenge of the perception of something is being lost as you are gaining something for safety is a real challenge, and one that we will continue to face. And I'll talk a little later about how I think we can provide some leadership and culture change there. But I do think that was one of our greatest challenges. We are able to overcome that challenge, and I'll speak from the local level. And I also think this is universal to all of our work. And that we, by using data and using that data to tell a story, we're able to overcome some of that resistance, especially in Minneapolis, where by measuring where our biggest problems were with respect to safety, adopting a Vision Zero strategy into the cities, like all the way through the cities, capital programs, and in multiple policies, to use that data, tell the story, eventually tell the story at a statewide level, and have some really big wins like reducing speed limits citywide, to make safer streets citywide. I think there's tremendous opportunity for us to rely on the data, what it tells us, and to guide our decision-making forward. And then that really doubles back on our ability to tell the story to people who feel resistant or afraid of that kind of change that happens at the local level. I am in my own work right now, learning very quickly, trying to learn quickly on how to take that kind of local application experience, both from Salt Lake and in Minneapolis, and my previous role with NACTO, and interweave it into federal policy. And I want to recognize that that's not a job that's done alone. It's not done just by cities. It's not done just by the federal government. It's done by all the levels that you'll see through the next couple of hours on this call. And with the push, help, guidance of the NTSB, certainly Jane, Terry, and this amazing group of stakeholders that keep pushing, as you should, and all the information sharing that goes on in an event like this. So I'll leave it there and look forward to more questions.
Thank you, Robin. And yes, for all of you, please do feel free to call me Tom. You make me feel very old if you call me Member Chapman. Rachel Carpenter, a question for you. Rachel from Caltrans, please share with us some concrete actions that Caltrans has taken to illustrate its commitment to implementing the safe system approach in California.
Well, Tom, thank you for the question, and thank you so much for convening this roundtable and for your leadership in traffic safety. In California, safety has always been our top priority, but our numbers really have been trending in the wrong direction for some time now. And this is what we're, consistent with what we're seeing at the national level, as you mentioned in your welcoming remarks. So every year in California, about 3,600 individuals die on our transportation system. That average is about 10 per day. And about 3 of those are our most vulnerable road users, people who walk and bike. We can't normalize this. We need to do better. We need to do things differently. And at Caltrans now we are. So our shift began last year as we really critically reevaluated our old approach to traffic safety and improved to a new approach. So our new approach is really defined by a new sense of urgency around safety. And in addition to the urgency, we committed to 4 pillars to guide our new safety paradigm. These may sound a bit like what Jane just mentioned. Those 4 pillars are double down on what works, accelerate advanced technology, implement a safe system approach, and integrate equity. And really, 2 guidebooks have informed our new paradigm shift to take a more preventative approach. So those 2 guidebooks are the 2017 NTSB report on speeding related crashes and the RAND Road to Zero by 2050 report. So I could go into greater detail on each of those 4 strategic pillars, but for today's discussion and to answer your question, I really want to focus on that 3rd pillar, implementing a safe system approach. So we have been working to institutionalize safety at levels across the whole department. And our efforts to lead a safety culture change really began with a fundamental change to Caltrans itself about last year. So in order to establish high-level ongoing commitment to safety, we made a few important organizational changes to the department. So in January of 2020, we established a chief safety officer position. That's me. And around this time last year, we established a new division of safety programs and created several new high-level management positions devoted to safety. We also reorganized and brought on new staff into our new division to elevate safety. And in July of this year, in a process that's become known as our Strategic Highway Safety Plan pivot, we committed to those 4 pillars to guide our SHSP. So those 4 pillars were formally incorporated into our SHSP. And just recently, those 4 pillars were incorporated into our Caltrans 2020 to 2024 strategic management plan. So that's sort of our 5-year roadmap that will inform our department's decisions over the next 5 years. And really with this reorganization and all the corresponding activities that I've just mentioned, we really wanted to elevate the visibility of safety within the department. We wanted to give safety the prominence, the weight, and really the emphasis that it deserves. And we also wanted to dedicate specific resources and funds towards safety with which this new structure has really enabled us to do. I want to just take a few minutes to highlight a couple of Caltrans' more immediate efforts to change the way we talk about traffic safety. So we are really deliberately trying to change the conversation to emphasize that safety is a shared responsibility and it requires collective action. So we are now using the term crash instead of accident, and this language change really is deliberate. It reflects the fact that traffic crashes are in fact not accidental. So there are identifiable reasons for a crash, and most crashes are preventable. But there's still really a tendency, even within the department, even with that at Caltrans, to talk about accidents. And it's really this language that we're trying to change. One other example, and consistent with Dr. Bullen's earlier comments, we are moving away at the department from references to human error. There is a off-cited statistic, many of you may have heard, that 94% of crashes are due to human error. As many of you may recognize, there's a lot of things really wrong with this statement. So first off, it's not true. Traffic crashes are complex and they have many contributing factors. And second, this statement implicitly holds humans to an impossible standard. In reality, humans are not perfect. We make mistakes, and mistakes don't have to result in fatalities or serious injuries. So instead, we can design for and accommodate mistakes by changing the system. That's street design, that's vehicle speeds, to make it safer. This is really the safe system approach. And so we're moving away from that reference to human error. And really in changing the conversation, we want to emphasize that we should change the transportation system to be safer instead of trying to change human behavior. We've also undertaken a number of initiatives to implement the safe system approach. And one of the sort of initiatives that I'm most excited about is developing a new approach to setting speed limits based on safe system principles. So the safe system approach to setting speed limits has been used worldwide, but it really contrasts with California's current speed limit setting methodology. So currently in California, we have a legislated method to set speed limits that's based on something called the 85th percentile. And it really is an outdated approach that's no longer meeting the needs of our multimodal, very complex system. So we have started a research project that is anticipated to be completed in early 2020 that'll develop a new method of setting speed limits that does not use driver behavior. So we've structured the deliverables within this report with the goal of having something implementable in mind, really an action plan of sorts. The last example that I want to mention is just that our institutional commitment to the safe system approach has allowed our pedestrian and bicyclist safety improvement programs to receive further funding and resources. Over the last 5 years, we've piloted pedestrian and bicyclist safety improvement programs, and I'm happy to share that we've now developed and implemented a permanent program that includes both a hotspot or reactive and a systemic or proactive program. So we now have safety programs that allow us to look at locations not only where pedestrian and bicyclist crashes have occurred, but look at locations that are at risk for a crash to occur. So that gives you just a little flavor of some of the things that we're doing in California. I'm very excited by the progress that we've made, but I really want to just stress that the progress we've made is really just the beginning of what we think of as a journey. So we've taken sort of the fundamental objectives of the safe system approach and sort of fit it to Caltrans in California. That's what I'd urge all state DOTs to do, really use its objectives and its principles to chart your own path. Thanks so much.
Very helpful. Thank you, Rachel. Betty Smoot-Madison, thank you for joining us from Atlanta. Betty, tell us about the background of Atlanta's Vision Zero program and its emphasis on speed management.
Sure. Well, first, thank you, Tom, and the entire NTSB team for inviting Atlanta to be a part of this important discussion. We really do consider ourselves to be the newbies here, especially since ATL DOT is really only about a year old. So we are learning a lot from our fellow cities and plugging into as many of the resources out there as possible from many of the organizations, such as the ones on this call, just to make sure that we are starting off right as a new organization. So just as a little bit of background, in 2019, in advance of the department being stood up, the city hired Bloomberg Associates to help us with thinking through the organizing and structuring of the department and the creation of our One Atlanta Strategic Transportation Plan, which essentially we are using as our blueprint at this time. And that plan included a goal of adopting Vision Zero in the first year of the department being stood up. So we were able to reach that goal really even before the department was fully formed. We had our Vision Zero legislation adopted by City Council in April of 2020, and we weren't fully formed until June 2020. So in 2019, Atlanta had 73 traffic-related fatalities, in which over half of those were attributed to speeding. So this was really the driver behind our decisions to prioritize safe systems and speed management as a critical first step for our Vision Zero work. And as a part of the adoption of our Vision Zero legislation, we included the authorization to implement a default 25-mile-per-hour speed limit. So our crews are actively out now, changing out over 1,000 signs on our streets. And we're also working on a lot of public awareness around that. But as Rachel explained, this type of effort comes with its own set of challenges. We were really only able to change the speed limits on certain streets, and that's streets that were fully under our control, so just really local streets, and then some of our downtown collectors and arterials. It also, we were not able to apply that 25-mile-per-hour speed limit on any streets that were state controlled, and then also it doesn't include state-owned roads, in which the majority of our arterial streets are state-owned. And our arterials have about 4 times the fatality rate than any of our other streets, and our locals especially. We were able to include, as I mentioned, the arterials and collectors that are in the downtown core, but a lot of our data shows that the significant risk, or the highest risk, were on arterials that run through many of our communities. So we still have some work to do there. We also could not include streets that are located on a pre-approved state list of roads, which allows our local law enforcement to run radar on. And in order to change the speed limits on those streets, our state DOT requires engineering traffic and speed studies using 85th percentile as done in California, as Rachel mentioned. So these are still challenges that we are trying to work around, but being able to lean on national best practices and guidance publications, such as NACTO's speed limits guidance, is really helpful for us and will be a big part of our strategy for speed management going forward. And while the One Atlanta Strategic Transportation Plan does have a number of goals and specific actions related to Vision Zero, we are still looking forward to developing our Vision Zero specific action plan in the coming year. We have funding laid out for that, and that will lay out the framework for our program overall, and start to really hone in on how we will reach our target. So we've had a busy first year as a department, and we've had some wins, but we still have a lot of hills and challenges to overcome. And we're definitely entering exciting times as we really start to work on our Vision Zero action plan. And we're excited to work closely with communities and stakeholders and partners on this work.
Thank you, Betty. A quick follow-up for you. How has the community reaction been, if any, to your speed management efforts?
We've had a lot of support. When we passed the Vision Zero legislation, our public hearings during council meetings were probably the fullest that I've ever seen. And a lot of it was support. I did not hear any opposition in the room, really. So communities have been very receptive to it.
That's good. That's encouraging. I want to stay with you for a minute. Like many cities in the US, Atlanta has a very diverse population. How does Atlanta DOT ensure equity in the planning and implementation of its Vision Zero program?
It's a great question, Tom. So I really consider myself blessed to have been able to work all throughout my career in highly diverse cities and communities. I started my career in Prince George's County, Maryland, which is one of the wealthiest, predominantly Black counties in the nation. I worked in the city of Baltimore, which is also highly diverse. And now here in Atlanta, which we call it the Center for Black Excellence. So we really thrive off of that. Atlanta has a population of about 500,000, and more than half of that is Black and African American people. I know I don't have to say it, but Atlanta is known for being the center for civil rights, and birthing some of the biggest civil rights leaders of our time, and not even to mention, just the music and culture that exists here. So that's something we love and cherish about Atlanta. And I don't think that anyone that lives here wants to change that. However, the city is growing. It's growing substantially, and that's something we welcome, but we want to make sure that we really preserve the existing communities that are here, and that the old isn't pushed out with or replaced by the new. And that comes with many different things. That requires cross collaboration with many departments and many stakeholders and partners, and making sure that we truly are listening to communities throughout our public processes. And I'm assured by the many conversations that the city is having, not just DOT, but in conversations with other departments like city planning and watershed management and parks and recreation. We are all having dialogue around equity and what that means for us. And that makes a difference when all of the city departments are united in wanting to improve yet preserve our communities and the residents that are here. So that's that's just some context, but equity is something that we want to be foundational in our Vision Zero program. Definitely not to be treated as an afterthought, but truly what we stand on with our Vision Zero work. To be data driven and having safety and equity as the foundations of the program. So soon after the Vision Zero legislation passed last year, one of the immediate things that we worked on was developing the framework for identifying communities of concern. We analyzed a lot of neighborhood level data, but ultimately honed in on communities with high percentages of no vehicle access households, high percentages of vulnerable populations, such as school-aged children and older adults and seniors, low income residents, residents with no health insurance, single parent households, because these are all populations that would be highly and adversely impacted by traffic crashes. Either through medical expenses or loss of transportation, having to be out of work, et cetera. Also looked at transit reliability in these communities, and then race. So how we are utilizing this equity data is kind of twofold. One, we are using it as a part of our project prioritization model. And that model is based on safety, equity, and mobility. And so that prioritization model will help us in the selection of projects and getting funding, and really channeling resources to those communities. And then the second part is through tailored engagement with those communities as a part of our Vision Zero work. We really want to make sure that we have very candid and tailored conversations with those communities, and truly listen to what their needs are and what their priorities are, and let that really drive some of our work and decision making. So we are hopeful that this work will be truly meaningful and really driving, funding and resources towards the communities that really need it most. And we are, as I mentioned before, we are starting to see overlaps as other departments develop their equity tools and prioritizations. We are seeing many of the same communities rise to the top. And so I think the outcomes will ultimately be that we are making huge public investments as a city in those communities that have historically been underinvested.
Thank you. This equity is a concern and a big challenge for all of us these days. Jane Terry, returning to you with a question. How should states and communities integrate behavioral interventions and primarily enforcement into the safe system approach?
So before I address that, I did want to just comment on a common theme that I heard from all my other co-panelists, and that is one of how important it is to be able to have local decision makers be able to even make decisions about the safety of their own communities. And I think that that's definitely a key takeaway, because as has been said, safe systems, Vision Zero, it doesn't look the same everywhere. And right now there are some artificial handcuffs, if you will, on some communities from being able to really make the decisions to prioritize safety. And I'm so glad to hear about choices and decisions we've heard about today by state officials to allow lowering speeds and other safety measures to really help communities to make those decisions for themselves, and just encourage all states and cities to be able to look at that, to be able to have that local control and make safety decisions that reflect your communities. And then now to your question, Tom, I appreciate that. So I think this is really at the heart of that third pillar of prioritizing safety on the road to zero pillars that I mentioned earlier, really affecting the attitudes and beliefs of our roadway users. And unfortunately, what we saw last year, of course, was with a huge decrease in the number of vehicles on the roadway as a result of lockdowns and the pandemic. We saw double-digit increases in the fatality rates on our roads. And that was due to speeding, distracted driving, impaired driving, and other factors, and also operating in a system that has not necessarily been prioritized for safety. And so I think when evaluating this through the 5 aspects of a safe system, I think there is a way to affect these reasons behind these crashes through focusing on safe roads, safe road users, and safe vehicles. But all of those do take time. And until then, we're continuing to operate in a system that we have. And this is a system that has been built with an understanding that enforcement is going to be a main component to ensure safety. And at the National Safety Council, we support fair and equitable enforcement of our traffic safety laws and fully support other means of enforcement, such as automated enforcement for red light and speeding. We just actually issued a checklist with some other safety groups for communities on automated enforcement, helping them to understand best practices for implementing these tools within their own communities, with safety as that main goal, as opposed to other community priorities. And we also know that communities across the country are evaluating other ways to implement enforcement of traffic safety laws. I just learned of one community that's actually recruiting law enforcement officers and educating them about the infrastructure design and how changes in infrastructure design can actually reduce the occurrence of crashes, and how this can hopefully decrease the amount of times they're called out to deal with these types of crashes. Additionally, some other communities are looking to law enforcement officers to help them understand where are the problem spots within the system, the infrastructure system, and how can changes potentially be made to help improve the safety and add some safety margin into there. I think all of this gets to what I know I, as a safety advocate, and I think law enforcement officers and TSB highway investigators all want to do, and that's really work ourselves out of a job and really reach this goal of zero fatalities.
Thank you. Rachel, a question for you. Your professional background combines traditional engineering and active involvement in transportation. Do you find that your somewhat unique perspective is helpful in persuading Caltrans leadership to embrace the overall safe system approach?
Certainly, thanks, Tom. I think my background really has helped the department embrace the safe system approach. A little on me, I have bachelor's and master's in civil engineering and focused my graduate work on traffic modeling, traffic flow, so really very traditional transportation engineering topics. But most of my professional career has been focused on vulnerable road user safety. So both at the local level with the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency and also at Caltrans overseeing and really standing up a pedestrian and bicyclist safety program. So I really approach my current position as the department's chief safety officer with deep knowledge in traditional transportation engineering and also a heightened awareness of active transportation. And one reoccurring area of concern, as Deputy Secretary Trottenberg mentioned in her opening remarks, are disproportionate impacts suffered by pedestrians, pedestrian fatalities and serious injuries. When we look at California public roads over the last 15 years, we've seen that the pedestrian percentage of total fatalities is on the rise, and that actually far outpaces the pedestrian mode share, making it a disproportionate impact on California pedestrians. And what's worse is that it's even worse really for pedestrians of color, making it traffic violence a racial justice issue as well. We've begun to explore safety data through an equity lens, and our analysis shows that a low-income person is 2 times as likely to be killed as a high-income person in a traffic crash while walking. And of those killed, African Americans in California are about 62% times more likely to be the victim than white pedestrians. So really the safe system approach aims to eliminate fatal and serious injuries for all road users by accommodating human mistakes and also keeping impacts at a tolerable level. And I think this is really especially important for our most vulnerable road users. I just want to end by mentioning that I think we all agree that no roadway fatalities are acceptable. And as Dr. Belind mentioned, a number of Latin American countries have committed to the safe system approach. And what we've seen is that advocates for vulnerable road user safety have made up really a fundamental pillar to support the adoption of the safe system approach. So I think that that's important and just telling on how critical moving to a new approach for road safety is, especially as it relates to vulnerable road users. I'll end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Mats, I have a question for you, but first I want to thank you very much for joining us again today, particularly knowing that it's late in the day there in Sweden where you are. Your contribution has been very helpful to us. My question is there a need to incorporate safe system principles into the traditional engineering education curricula?
Yeah, let me first make a little bit of remarks of what I've heard today from the panels. Last year in February, Sweden organized the 3rd global conference on road safety. And one of the key message from that conference was that we have to see Vision Zero and safety integrated to the whole sustainable development goals. And for me, it's obvious. Equity, pedestrians, we need more cycling, we need more pedestrians because it's good from a climate perspective. And one of the barriers here is safety, actually. So it's obvious for me how safety is interrelated to all different aspects when it comes to the sustainable development goals. I just want to make that remark. So safety is not a standalone thing. We need to integrate it in a much broader way that we also usually traditionally haven't done yet, I would say. So then come back to this engineering, and I must be honest, I don't know the curriculum for engineers in US, but I have a sense based on my experience now that we really need to dig into it now and when it comes to engineers, and there is a need of more knowledge about kinetic energy. Because that has to do with injuries. So that should be part of a curriculum. We need ethical standards that go very beyond this blunt cost-benefit analysis, because this is much more complicated. We talked today about pedestrians versus car drivers and so on, and we need to talk about these ethical issues much more. And we need this not engineers just focus on one part of the system. We need them to be much more broader in their perspective, because things are linked to each other. The car and the roadway and this whole digital movement now when we see new technology. So we need engineers now that have a much more holistic system perspective of things. And finally, I think that, and people have been talking about it today, we need transforming leadership. We need people that are doing this from a mission-oriented perspective, and we need to manage this now, and therefore within this engineering curriculum now, we need a different type of managers now that actually help us to make a difference, to transform what we are now into the future, I would say. So definitely there is a huge need of changing this curriculum, and it's urgent, because that is our next generation that will help us to achieve what we would like to achieve. And my experience is that the engineering, especially when it comes to road and transport, is very conservative. And they need to be part of this in a way that they haven't used to. We heard today, for example, setting the speed according to 85 percentile. That's old stuff. That's not what we talking about now. It's much more other criteria for setting the speed based on vision zero principles and so on, and that needs to be reflected also in the education and the curriculum for the new generation of engineers, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mats. Our final question for this panel goes to you, Robin. Tell us, what role can and should the Department of Transportation and other federal partners play in implementing the safe system approach?
Thank you, Tom, for that question as kind of a final question. And I want to reflect that because I've heard so many similar themes from each of you, that I believe that we are on a path to the culture change that is needed in this country. I hear widespread agreement about what needs to happen. I hear it from all levels of government, from advocacy organizations. I hear it from the international community. I hear it from my own organization in the Department of Transportation. And I think we are ready for a culture change. And I believe that that is one of the most important roles that the US government can play. I'm not saying it's easy or fast, but I'm saying that we can see it, and I think we do see it as an imperative. So first, one role, culture change. Two, I believe that we have to provide some leadership in a space where perhaps the leadership has not been consistent with what cities and towns and advocacy across the country have been asking for. And the way to do that is by doing the third thing, which is to do more. I believe we need to do more. More for safer roads. And this is where we're saying the same things. We're becoming repetitive on each other, which is only a good thing. Safer roads, both in speed and design, safer vehicles, in leveraging everything we can that technology has to offer us to make it safer for inside and outside the vehicle. I believe we need to change how we talk about it. That begins from the top, we know that. Crash, not accident. What we expect from our engineering community, the education and support that we provide to our states, who have an incredible responsibility for implementing safety. And finally, funding notes your priorities. And we are going to propose and fight for that funding for safety. The American Jobs Plan proposes, never before, $20 billion specifically for safety, with $10 billion in a Safe Streets for All fund that is to help local communities, as well as some additional funding for states. So I think we put our money down where our culture goes, where we want our culture to go. So I want to say that I believe this administration and certainly the secretary, and you heard from Deputy Secretary Trottenberg, who has been a tireless advocate for this, that we want to foster the change that is needed, a new culture, provide leadership and support to all of our partners, and to do more for safer roads, safer vehicles, communications funding, and really to embrace and implement a safe systems. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Robin. Unfortunately, that concludes the time we have for our first panel. I want to thank all of you for a lively exchange of information. And for our panel, please remain with us on Zoom. But before we move on to the next group, I want to remind you to please turn off your audio and your video. Now I would like to invite Tom Barth, Natalie Drayson, NTSB member Jennifer Homendy, Adrian Lund, Jeff Paniati, and Brittany Rollinson to join us for a discussion of the elements of the safe system approach. Before we begin, I want to offer a brief introduction for each of our panelists. Dr. Thomas Barth is an investigator and biomechanics engineer with NTSB. For the past 10 years with the agency, Dr. Barth has focused on crash survivability, emergency response, and emergency technology. Natalie Drayson leads the FIA Foundation in its mission to promote innovative global road safety philanthropy. Ms. Drayson founded Vision Zero for Youth and has been a leader in road safety efforts at the UN. My colleague, NTSB member Jennifer Homendy, is the 44th member of the National Transportation Safety Board, and she has been instrumental in advocating for safety in all modes of transportation. Jennifer is a leading voice on the board regarding issues impacting vulnerable road users. We're pleased to have the benefit of her perspective for today's discussion. Dr. Adrian Lund, throughout his 36-year career, has led and contributed to work that spanned a wide range of issues that impact safety of all road users. Dr. Lund is formerly the president of the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety and brings his extensive knowledge of the scientific approach to highway safety. Jeff Paniati is the executive director and CEO of the Institute of Transportation Engineers, an international membership association of transportation professionals who work to improve mobility and safety for all transportation system users and help build smart and livable communities. Mr. Paniati previously held leadership positions in intelligent transportation systems and highway safety within the Federal Highway Administration. And finally, Dr. Brittany Rollinson is a relative newcomer to NTSB. She joined the agency in 2020, where she is a statistician in the Safety Research Division. Prior to joining NTSB, Dr. Rollinson was a research analyst in the Office of Labor Policy and Standards at the New York City Department of Consumer Affairs. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Tom Barth, I'm going to start with a question for you. Traditionally, police crash investigations and reports focus on the very latest action of a crash. And we heard this referenced earlier. That has led to an often cited statistic that 90+% of crashes are attributed to driver errors. Such statistics can be misleading. Excuse me. They can be misleading. How do NTSB investigations differ from that approach? And how does our protocol align with the safe system approach?
Yeah, thanks for the question. The NTSB investigations are different because they look into not only the last action causing the incident, but the background and the contributing factors affecting the outcome. I think the statistic about the driver error you mentioned can be misleading because it doesn't account for the root cause, which often leads to that driver error. Our investigations take a comprehensive systems approach to identify the contributing factors that all affect the outcome. I'd also mention that the NTSB investigations are unique in their breadth of the work they do. For example, we look at the emergency response and other elements that can mitigate risks for injury or for anyone involved. This allows us to look at the whole system and explore solutions that get to those underlying root causes.
Thank you, Tom. Jeff Paniati, a question for you. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. While we often hear calls for a paradigm shift, many roadway design tools already exist. Share with us some of these existing tools that are fundamental in the safe system approach, and tell us whether they are applicable not just in urban areas or also in rural areas.
Thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for your leadership in putting together this roundtable. I think a very important topic, very timely on the part of NTSB. I do think, and you've heard some of this already from Mats, when you start down the road of the safe system approach, it does start with embracing a particular mindset and philosophy. And that mindset and philosophy is that you're going to prioritize reducing fatalities and serious injuries over crashes. We're going to focus on reducing kinetic energy, which means managing speed. We're going to anticipate drivers are going to make errors, and we're going to do everything we can to prevent those from happening. And we're going to take a proactive and systematic approach. We're going to look at it as a system, not just look at individual crashes. I think if you think about that mindset and that philosophy, that's not an urban mindset or a rural mindset. That's a safety mindset that applies across the entire system. Now, when we think about urban areas, the kinds of tools or treatments or approaches we might take are a little bit different than we might in rural areas. So in an urban area, we're going to pay more attention to vulnerable road users, right? We have a crisis of fatalities and injuries involving pedestrians and bicyclists today. And so treatments like protected bike lanes, protected intersections, hardening center lines, and using leading pedestrian intervals, using road diets. Those are all treatments that we can use successfully, have been using successfully in the US for a number of years now, and can under a safe system approach. When we look at rural areas, we might do things a little bit different. In rural or suburban areas, the roundabout is a perfect safe system tool and treatment. It's been used widely around the world. It's begun to be used more frequently in the US. And it's really the poster child for managing speeds, right? Because we know at roundabouts, we might have a few more rear end crashes, but we also know no one dies at a roundabout. Speeds are managed, conflicts are managed in a way that reduces the harm as a result of a crash at a roundabout. You heard Mats talk about centerline roadway median barriers, but very effective for virtually eliminating crossover fatalities. Centerline and shoulder rumble strips. Those are great treatments for thinking about drivers that will be a little fatigued, drivers that might be a little distracted. And what we're doing is we're getting their attention and getting them focused back on the roadway before that crash occurs. So a lot of different techniques and treatments already in our toolbox, and it's a matter of thinking about and applying those from that safe system philosophy.
Thank you, Jeff. Natalie Drayson, your work takes you to many places, particularly in developing countries. Based on your travels, what have you learned which might be helpful to U.S. cities and communities as they seek to implement the safe system approach?
Thanks so much for this question, excuse me, and for having me today. I'd like to highlight 3 things. First, Vision Zero is not a tagline. Second, as we heard on the first panel, it's about equity. And third, right now is really our chance to implement it. So first, Vision Zero is so much more than just a slogan. And if we just pay it lip service, we're going to turn around in 10 years and say that it didn't work. So conversations like this and leadership from the NTSB and DOT is so crucial to understanding the underlying safe systems approach and implementing it. And as you just heard from Jeff, we can start by lowering speeds. And that's the focus of this week, UN Global Road Safety Week. The UN, the WHO, and US organizations are calling for 20-mile-an-hour roads in urban areas where vulnerable road users and vehicles mix. So if you're listening and you're a decision maker, I would ask you to please lower speeds. And for everyone else, there are plenty of advocacy resources at unroadsafetyweek.org. Now, second, Vision Zero is about equity. I love that Mexico just made mobility a constitutional right for everybody. And it's a human right. And this means that applying the safe systems approach isn't about just doing it in privileged areas, but it's about doing it where people are suffering most. Because fatal and serious crashes discriminate, because we built a system that discriminates. I've seen firsthand why 90% of road traffic fatalities occur in low and middle income countries. We see these disparities right here at home in historically marginalized and disinvested communities. And we can address this by collaborating with community-based organizations and following their lead, applying the safe systems approach in a contextually appropriate and sensitive way. And finally, globally, we have a unique opportunity and need to implement Vision Zero. We're having a very long overdue conversation about equity and the benefits of streets that prioritize people. We can fight this unprecedented spike in fatalities through the safe systems approach. And it's desired. New Yorkers love their 67 miles of streets with reduced traffic so much that they'll be here to stay, and the program will even be expanded. Seattle's doing the same thing. 60% of the cyclists on new bike lanes in Paris had never been on a bike before, so those lanes are staying too. There's more political will and public acceptance for this than ever.
Thank you, Natalie. Adrian, I have a question for you based upon your past work and experience. In 2015, IIHS and NHTSA worked to persuade some 20 automakers to commit voluntarily to make automatic emergency braking standard on all new light-duty vehicles by September 2020. Will you please tell us how that was accomplished? And you're muted, Adrian.
Technically challenged. Anyway, thank you for the question, Tom, and thank you for hosting this meeting. I think back to when I first started at the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. We were really about safe systems. We just didn't talk about that. As we could not have had this kind of meeting then. It really took, the Swedish folks making this a little more sexy with the term Vision Zero. And then safe systems has come about, and it's really good to hear this going on. Now, about that commitment to AEB, I think, there were several things that made this possible. The first that was important was that at the time we had a strong National Highway Traffic Safety Administration under Dr. Mark Rosekind. And the agency was very interested in getting this new technology, which was proving to be so effective at preventing rear-end crashes, into vehicles. And they were not optimistic about how quickly they could get regulation to push that. So, but the thing is, we did have a strong agency that could regulate in that area. The second element was that the IIHS was a credible and trusted partner, I think, for both the agency and for the automakers. Trusted by the automakers because IIHS had worked with NHTSA before to broker voluntary agreements in terms of limiting the danger from danger to out of position occupants when side airbags deploy, and also vehicle compatibility. And IIHS was credible because we already were working with our European counterparts and developing tests for AEB, and we're already testing and rating vehicles. So the automakers knew or IIHS was a proven quantity. But the third thing, which I think is very important, is that you keep in mind that the auto industry is not a monolithic or thing. That is, there are safety leaders in that industry. And there was a core of automakers who were leading in getting AEB into vehicles, and they were willing to come together and commit early to this. And I think, there's some self-interest in that regard, in that they were making a real investment in getting this safety technology into their vehicles, and they wanted the rest of the industry to also be making that monetary commitment, or if not, to be identified as lagging behind. So basically it's three elements: a strong National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, a credible partner in the IIHS, and then the willingness of a core group of safety leaders in the auto industry to put pressure on their peers.
Thank you, Adrian. Really following up on that, a question for my board colleague, Jennifer Homendy. Jennifer, are NTSB recommendations regarding forward collision avoidance technologies consistent with voluntary adoption of these technologies?
Yeah, Jane, and thank you, Tom, for having this event and for inviting me to participate as well. Jane mentioned earlier on the earlier panel the crisis that we have on our hands with fatalities on our nation's roads, and it really is a public health crisis. In March, Jane is with the National Safety Council. In March, they issued a press release stating that motor vehicle deaths in 2020 are estimated to be the highest in 13 years, despite dramatic decreases in vehicle miles traveled. And preliminary data showed that as many as 42,000 people are estimated to have died in traffic crashes in 2020. So proven technologies like forward collision warning and automatic emergency braking have saved lives, which is why collision avoidance technology is on our most wanted list again. I say again because we've recommended since 1995 that NHTSA develop performance standards for forward collision warning and automatic emergency braking, and that the technology be required and made standard on all vehicles, passenger and commercial, not just light duty vehicles. The voluntary agreement, which Adrian mentioned, was a step forward in terms of improving safety, but it only applies to light duty vehicles and it is voluntary. Some manufacturers have made significant progress to meet their commitments, but others are lagging behind. In fact, I saw an industry release a few weeks ago, which stated that some manufacturers wanted even more time. But because it's voluntary, the commitments that were made are not enforceable. And so we have continually recommended that the technologies be required. Also, I just want to mention that one way to incentivize auto manufacturers to include advanced safety capabilities in their vehicles whether it's collision avoidance or speed governors or limiters, is through comprehensive crash testing and vehicle safety rating programs like Euro NCAP does. We've recommended that NHTSA make significant changes to the US New Car Assessment Program and bring it more in line with what Europe is doing, and hopefully they'll be making those changes. In fact, industry and safety groups are aligned on this. That release from industry that I mentioned a few weeks ago also called for major changes for NCAP. So hopefully that's on the way soon.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. Next, a question for our NTSB colleague, Dr. Brittany Rawlinson. Brittany, what improvements to our crash and injury data systems should we envision to help shape our thinking with respect to the safe system approach?
So as you heard from other panelists, we know that crash data comes from police crash reports, but this data can often be misleading and sometimes it's incomplete. NHTSA works with GHSA on improving crash reporting and revising guidance documents, but states need to implement this guidance for it to be effective. And some of this guidance includes training police officers on how to collect data on the scene of the crash. Improvements can also be made in the types of data we collect, namely behavioral and structural data. For example, much of the current data lacks attributes of roadway environments, as well as pre-crash actions of all road users. So collecting this data will allow for us to determine the rates of crashes and injuries over time, and it's particularly critical for pedestrians and bicyclists. We also need data that goes beyond fatalities, which is important to note because the only source of national non-fatal injury statistics comes from police crash reports, whereas injury data typically comes from emergency departments and sometimes hospital data. So because this data comes from different sources, we end up in a situation where the circumstances of the accident come from one source and the extent of the injury comes from another. So medical data needs to be linked to police data, which is not effectively being done right now. Because of these limitations, the NTSB has made recommendations in improving crash data and data linkage. So I think we're moving in the right direction. Thank you for the question, and I'm happy to be here with all of you.
Thank you, Brittany. Adrian, I want to return to you. What are the lessons learned from the progress made in safety technologies like safety belts, airbags, and electronic stability control in the past 50 years? And how can those lessons help us push for advanced technologies that protect not only the occupants in vehicles, but also vulnerable road users outside of those vehicles?
Well, thank you, Tom. I think one of the key things we've learned is that the vehicle is a very effective place to intervene to prevent this harmful exchange of kinetic energy. One of the key issues here is that the automotive engineers, or the engineers in the automotive industry, are a creative group. They are always coming up with new ways, new technology that can protect us from ourselves, from the errors that we make when we drive. That was the case for occupant protection, where we've seen so much improvement, but we're now seeing new tech as well. We've already talked about automatic emergency braking, but there are lane keeping systems and lane keeping systems that have a very high degree of authority that can really help prevent run off the road crashes and crossing the center line types of crashes. And the AEB systems and some of the blind spot systems are getting better at recognizing vulnerable road users, whether they're bicyclists or pedestrians or motorcyclists. So that technology is coming. They're very creative. The problem is to get it into vehicles as quickly as possible. And what we've learned there is that there's a dynamic interplay between the push of regulation and the pull or demand, if you will, of consumer information. Regulation is how you really nail things home and make sure that everybody stays on the same page and is putting the equipment in their cars. But oftentimes we move much faster with consumer information. That is by doing tests and showing people the differences among cars and how much safer they are in some cars than others, the cars with the newer technology. We put pressure on the automakers to adopt that technology. And I think the third thing that we've learned is that the safety information that we can provide creates a positive feedback loop. Some information about safety just seems to whet the appetite for more information about safety, for safety in additional vehicles. Anyone who's done crash testing, they can tell you that it's not enough that you publish the ratings for the vehicles that you've tested, but the person wants to know, when are you going to test the vehicle that I'm interested in? So we really have this positive feedback loop. The more safety information we can put out there, the more there's a demand for it, the more that can support consumer information programs, and the more that can support regulators when it comes time to put requirements for technology into the regulations.
Thank you, Adrian. Natalie, did you want to add?
I would love to. Thank you so much. You know, Adrian talked about NCAP and how it helps consumers drive safety. UN Global Road Safety Week seems like a really fitting time to commend NCAP on doing this, not just domestically, but also internationally. Our partner Global NCAP exported this model to make cars safer all over the world. And this is an excellent example of why it's so important that the US is reestablishing its role as a leader in global road safety, just like we're doing here today. Now, NCAP's model has been applied to infrastructure, recognizing that just like consumers have a right to know how safe their cars are and fuel demand for vehicle safety, consumers have the right to know how safe their streets are and fuel demand for safe streets. And that's how the International Road Assessment Program, or IRAP, came to be. And we have a US RAP too, by the way, and it rates roads on a 1 to 5 star scale. There's 2 ways that this can be used to increase safety. First, with limited budgets, we can target high-risk roads. IRAP estimates that 50% of fatalities happen on less than 10% of our roads. And the WHO says that if we could prevent a whopping 3.6 million deaths and 40 million serious injuries over 20 years if we improved those roads through infrastructure that protects vulnerable road users and lowers speeds. Second, we could also strive for minimum safety standards on all roads, because again, that is a human right. And IRAP says that if 75% of our travel was on 3-star or better roads, we would save over 450,000 lives per year and prevent over 100 million deaths and serious injuries over 20 years. But the first step is collecting data and sharing it with consumers, just like Adrian said, and just like NCAP and IRAP are doing. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. Thanks to both of you. Next question is for Tom Barth. Tom, these are some issues that arose in a very tragic accident that the board dealt with back in the later part of last year. In Randolph, New Hampshire was the accident, as I'm sure you know. Motorcycle issues. Tell us, how is advanced vehicle technology changing the operating environment for motorcycles? And you're muted, Tom.
Yep, I was clicking on the wrong button. Yeah, there are a lot of interesting technology developments for motorcycle safety. Things like automatic emergency braking, adaptive headlights, vehicle-to-vehicle systems, and even protective clothing with integrated airbag systems are all in work. But as Member Hamady described, the NTSB has an active role in pushing for progress. And that the crash you mentioned in Randolph, New Hampshire in 2019, we've made recommendations for anti-lock brakes for motorcycles. Anti-lock brakes have been around for quite a while, but we feel that all new motorcycles should have this equipment. We also made recommendations in that report about helmet use and some of the other traditional safe riding practices. So I'd say that changing the motorcycle environment to be safer involves both a continued improvement on some of the basic safety measures and things that we already know are effective, changing that culture to really utilize those traditional methods, but also adopting the new technologies and pushing that forward to bring it all together.
Thank you, Tom. For Jennifer, drunk and impaired driving is a major concern for all of us. I know this is, as you know, this is an area where I focus a lot of my advocacy efforts. How can we leverage the safe system approach to help tackle impaired driving?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Tom. And as you alluded to, preventing alcohol and other drug impaired driving is another issue that's on our most wanted list. In 2019, 1 in 4 traffic fatalities resulted from crashes involving alcohol impaired drivers. And many of these impaired driving crashes involve drivers who both drink and use other drugs, and that's legal and illegal and over-the-counter drugs. Complicating matters, of course, as more and more states are passing laws allowing the use of marijuana. So that presents significant challenges. We know that impaired driving is 100% preventable, but it's a complex issue, which I believe requires a shift in focus from traditional approaches. That's not to say we shouldn't still focus on education and fair and just enforcement that's data-driven and evidence-based. But we need to look at the issue more holistically. Recently, IAHS issued a study showing how in-vehicle technologies, if implemented, can eliminate nearly 10,000 deaths due to impaired driving. Of course, the NTSB also has recommendations to reduce BAC to 0.05 to align with standards in many other countries around the world and the state of Utah. But one important piece of all of this is something I think we have to look at as leaders, government leaders, and then across the different coalitions, is we have to bring more non-traditional partners to the table and work with us to improve safety, like public health professionals, mental health and substance abuse professionals. That is occurring with some organizations in some states and of course across the globe. But I think coalitions and organizations need to do that more and partner with them to try to reduce impaired driving. But then also, and Mats referenced this earlier, where he said things, and this is his quote, things are linked to each other. We really have to look not just at this person drove impaired, whether it's drunk or drugs. We have to really look at what led to that. And we have to look at influences on our transportation safety and on the transportation network. And what I'm talking about here is access to alternative forms of transportation, healthcare, employment or unemployment, environmental issues, things that are just beyond what we've traditionally looked at in terms of traffic safety culture, and look at what influences people to make certain decisions and address that. That's not something that road safety professionals have done traditionally in the past. And we really need to start looking at how those factors influence safety on our nation's roads.
Thank you, Jennifer. A very big challenge for all of us with no easy answers. Natalie, a question for you regarding an area of focus that I know is particularly important to you. Please share with us why it is important to prioritize road safety for youth and young people.
Absolutely. Well, the numbers in themselves are really compelling. Road traffic crashes are the #1 killer of youth at home and abroad. But youth can also be the catalyst for a wider safe systems approach. And that's why we co-founded Vision Zero for Youth with the National Center for Safe Routes to School. New York City is one of our award winners, and their school speed safety camera program was so successful, lowering speeds at over 70% at camera locations, that they actually expanded it. Another award winner, Bogota, Colombia, had months without any child fatalities in their city of 8 million, thanks to lowering speeds in over 2,000 school zones. And in the beginning of 2019, fatalities among all ages there were the lowest in a decade. Zero is possible. Oslo, Norway reached zero partly by closing areas around schools, calling them heart zones. They really place children at the heart, and that's what we have to do. But there's a lot more to be done. Vision Zero plans often exclude children and sometimes only include them as targets of education. And now, while we're trying desperately to send our kids back to school safely, there's real urgency to fix this. The solutions to keeping kids safe from COVID and road traffic injuries on the way to school are low cost, and they're one and the same, like creating space for safe school drop-off and pickup or closing down all or part of the street. There are plenty of solutions in the guidance I wrote with UNICEF, and I'm really happy to share that resource. I hope it'll be helpful to everyone. It's going to be a while until all of our kids are vaccinated, so let's use the speed vaccine that we have now.
Thank you, Natalie. Jeff, I want to learn a little bit more about some of the work that's important to your organization, ITE. I know that ITE and the Johns Hopkins Center for Injury Research and Policy recently made important recommendations on the topic of the safe system approach. What is the overall focus and priority of those recommendations?
Yes, thank you, Tom. Yes, earlier this year, ITE partnered with Johns Hopkins University to bring together what we call the Safe System Consortium. And the impetus for it was seeing a new administration come in at the US DOT and seeing prospects for significant investment in infrastructure through standalone bills or through a reauthorized federal surface transportation authorization. And so we brought a set of leading experts together from the US and internationally. A number of folks that have participated in this panel and the panel before it were part of that consortium. And what they did is they looked at the evidence that exists today in support of advancing the safe system approach and developed a series of recommendations aimed primarily at the federal level. And most of the recommendations focus on the infrastructure side, but they were developed in the safe system context. That is, thinking about safer vehicles, safer roads, safer speeds, safer users, and effective post-crash care. And a number of the things that have come up in this panel were part of the conversation. For example, the importance of making data improvements and some of the comments that Brittany talked about a little while ago. The key effort that's needed to dispel this myth that crashes are 90% or more driver error related, work that Tom Barth talked about. The importance of advanced driver assistance systems and impairment detection that Jennifer and Adrian talked about. All of those were part of the conversation, but where the conversation centered was really looking at how we could advance safe system in the US on the infrastructure side. And I think the important distinction between what we've heard about internationally and in the US is really considering both safety and equity. Again, a number of panelists have talked about the importance of equity, and this group of experts felt that to move safe system forward in the United States, it needed to be paired very closely with equity considerations. And they identified three essential areas for change: safety across the system. And really the focus there was on the kinds of federal leadership that Robin talked about, the need for significant increases in federal funding to support Vision Zero and safe system implementation, and strong federal leadership from the US Department of Transportation to help guide efforts at the state and local level. The second area was equity through investment. And it really goes to some of the points that I think Betty made and some of the examples in Atlanta. that when we make investment decisions on safety, we need to consider equity. We need to consider communities that have been underserved, and we need to make the funding allocations and project selections with equity in mind. And then the third area was progress by design. And this really goes to the tools that practitioners use every day in making safety decisions. The AASHTO Green Book for geometric design, the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices for traffic control selection, and the Highway Safety Manual for safety decisions. All of those documents are in the process of being revised, and all of them need to embrace safe system principles at their core if we're going to move forward the safe system process and approach in the US. So those were some of the recommendations and the focus of this effort. If you want to see the full report, it's available at our website at www.ite.org. All you gotta do is go to the front page and you'll find it.
Great, thank you, Jeff. We look forward, all of us look forward to building on that work and on those recommendations. Returning to Dr. Rawlinson, Brittany, a question for you. In your view, what are the needed next steps to ensure that the safe system approach is implemented effectively?
Thank you. This is another great question. As I mentioned previously, the first step, I think, is to improve our crash and injury data and have the ability to link those data sources. I also think we need to collect exposure data. For a long time, we've mostly focused on monitoring motorized travel, which allowed us to calculate statistics such as crash rate per vehicle miles traveled. But we also need to capture non-motorized travel, like walking and biking. This will allow researchers and policymakers to have a better understanding of injury rates over time among vulnerable road users. This will also give us a better idea of how to improve equity in transportation. We need to have data that goes beyond just recording the number of pedestrians and bicyclists on the road, but tells us more about which populations are likely to be exposed to dangerous road conditions and where and when this exposure might occur. There are some advancements in this area, particularly by research and academic organizations, and we need to accelerate those advancements and widely implement them.
Thank you, Brittany. And finally, the last question for this panel goes to my colleague, Jennifer Homendy. Jennifer, you play an important role in leading the NTSB safety advocacy effort to eliminate speeding-related crashes. This is UN Global Safety Week, and the focus for this year's campaign is speed. Please share your experience and perspectives on how the NTSB has provided support for traffic safety stakeholders and what more can be done in this area.
Thanks for the question. And I'm pleased that the UN Global Road Safety Week is focused on speeding. And as Natalie mentioned, countries are calling for reducing speed limits to 20 miles per hour where people live, work, and play. And I hope we can do that here in the US at some point. Lowering speed limits is critical. I noticed a release from the Governor's Highway Safety Association, which said that, and not surprisingly, there were more pedestrian fatalities in 2020 despite decreases in traffic. And, you know, throughout the pandemic, I either tweeted or made comments or talked to the press about what we thought was what happened was not what we anticipated would happen or what has occurred in the past during economic downturns or global crises, which was a significant increase in fatalities and an increase in speeding. So we were pretty shocked. Just to give some figures here, the average risk of severe injury for a pedestrian increases from 10% at a 16 mile per hour vehicle impact speed to 25% at 23 miles per hour, 50% at 31 miles per hour, 75% at 39 miles per hour, and 90% at 46 miles per hour. So clearly, the higher the speed, the more risk of severe injury. And so the NTSB in 2017 issued a comprehensive study focused on reducing speeding related crashes. And I'm going to just mention a few things in there, one of which is changing how we set speed limits in our country. Jeff mentioned the MUTCD. There's language in the MUTCD which essentially tells states to set speed limits at 85th percentile speed of free-flowing traffic, which in turn only leads to increasing speed limits over time. I was a little concerned when I was on a state Department of Transportation website about a month ago, where they talked about the 85th percentile speed provision in the MUTCD, and their question under frequently asked questions on speeding, it said, will raising the speed limit cause motorists to speed up? And the state said no, and I'm quoting, raising the speed limit simply aligns the speed limit with actual traffic operation during favorable roadway conditions. That is not accurate. Raising the speed limit will cause motorists to speed up and more lives will be lost. So unfortunately, DOT did not include eliminating the 85th percentile in the recently proposed revisions to the MUTCD. It softened the language, but we have submitted new comments encouraging DOT to eliminate the 85th percentile language entirely. And so I hope they do that. Also, technology. I highlight that we are behind Europe when it comes to the use of technology like speed governors and intelligent speed assistance in vehicles to combat speeding. That's also something we focused on in our study. And I want to highlight our work, and something I've particularly focused on for our most wanted list efforts is to encourage states, and most recently I've been working with California to implement automated speed enforcement, which has been very successful overseas to drastically reduce speeding. Unfortunately, there has been a perception that automated speed enforcement efforts are really revenue generators. And I understand that perception and where it stems from, but we need to change those perceptions and talk about speed cameras as what they are. They're safety cameras. They are to improve safety and reduce fatality and reduce injuries. They are not revenue generators. And in fact, I do want to put in a plug for IAHS. I think Jane mentioned the checklist that they just issued along with National Safety Council and Governor's Highway Safety Association, where they talked about automated enforcement programs should be data driven and should prioritize safety, but that also they have to have a strong public information component. So bringing people together to realize the success of automated speed enforcement is critical. So those efforts are ongoing, and we will continue those at the NTSB and focus on combating speeding related crashes, and hope to work with more states to implement ASE and work with DOT to address speeding going forward.
Thank you, Jennifer, and our thanks to all of you for your helpful contributions during our discussion today. At this point, I want to ask our panelists to remain on Zoom, but please turn off your audio and video. As we near the end of today's event, I want to offer a few closing comments. In a safe system approach, the focus is on injury severity. From the outset, we seek to eliminate death and serious injury with an understanding there may be some crashes with less severity. We no longer try to turn all of us into perfect drivers, pedestrians, and bicyclists. It is assumed that we all make mistakes. The emphasis is on methods to prevent these mistakes from causing death or serious injuries. Human vulnerabilities are accommodated by managing kinetic energy through engineering, design, and policy. We also acknowledge that road safety is a shared responsibility among road users, designers, planners, engineers, corporations, and policymakers. With a strong safety culture at every level, from individuals to the federal government, we can address the safety needs of all road users, not just drivers. We understand that road users will make mistakes, so we double down on what works, such as well-designed and properly worn seat belts for all seating positions. We also promote vehicle technologies that already exist, such as automatic emergency braking and lane departure technology. We should accelerate development and adoption of additional advanced driver assistance systems. We know there are road designs that can create a safer environment for vulnerable road users. For example, separated bike lanes and separate traffic signal timing for pedestrians and motor vehicles. Because we know that injury severity is tied to kinetic energy, which is proportional to speed, we need to rethink speed management. Our roadways are over-designed to accommodate mobility, not safety. It is crucial to move forward using roadway design to better manage drivers' safe speed and to rethink how speed limits are set. Many of these tools are already here, and the NTSB has offered numerous safety recommendations which will reinforce the safe system approach. Further, we must implement proven behavioral measures such as education and enforcement. The important tools available to us should be used together in an integrated fashion to promote a broad, safe system approach. My thanks again to each of our outstanding participants in today's event, with special appreciation for the opening comments provided by Deputy Secretary Polly Trottenberg. Finally, I want to extend my most sincere gratitude to the staff at NTSB that helped put this event together. Behind the scenes, our folks from the Office of the CIO managed the technology to ensure we were able to share this important discussion in a virtual world. And I certainly want to highlight the efforts of Stephanie Shaw of our safety advocacy team and the superb work of my own team of Ivan Chung and Linda McGonigal. As I said at the outset, today's roundtable was intended to serve as an NTSB Most Wanted List kickoff event on this topic. There is more to come beginning on June 23rd with a roundtable to be hosted by board member Jennifer Homendy, focusing on specific elements of the safe system approach. We will soon share additional details regarding the June 23rd roundtable event. On behalf of today's panelists and all of us at NTSB, we appreciate those of you who have taken time to watch today's roundtable. Your interest is a critical element in our shared objective to address the tragic and growing number of avoidable deaths among all road users. Enjoy the remainder of your afternoon.